Hello, and welcome to Recruiting Personal Assistants, the Basics. My name is Chris Amner, and I've got over a decade's experience working within the personal assistant workforce, and I'm the Executive Officer within Brace Ring Lee. Today, I want to offer some guidance on the steps you need to take once you've chosen a personal assistant. It's an extremely important part of the process as it sets the tone for their employment with you. The guidance I'm going to provide focuses on wigging. However, much of the information provided should be useful for anyone employing PAs across the country. Throughout this webinar, I'll use the term individual employer. If you're unfamiliar with this phrase, it is commonly used to describe people who employ personal assistants. If you are watching this video, it is likely that you are an individual employer. I'll also use the abbreviation PA. This stands for personal assistant or personal assistant incur is often used as well. Whilst parts of this webinar are based on my own experience, I've also used a variety of reference material, which I'll share with you throughout. However, a key reference material I've used to create this webinar is a Skills for Care resource called Before Your PA Starts. And if you are someone who absorbs information more effectively reading a document rather than watching a video, I would recommend giving this resource a read. You should be able to find a link to the resource in the description of this webinar. I've organised this video in such a way that you shouldn't need to watch it in its entirety. I've split each part of the process into different chapters, and you should be able to see which topics I'll discuss at which times on the screen now. And then you should just be able to toggle through and listen to the bits you want to listen to when that's important to you. Let's start right at the beginning. You've just finished interviewing one or more potential candidates, and you've chosen who you'd like to be your new PA. Now, I'm going to make two slightly contradicting points, but hopefully it will make sense. Getting in touch with the candidates quickly is often essential. There is a shortage of social care staff, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, which means you are recruiting within a competitive environment. The longer you wait, the more chance the candidate may have taken another position, because it is likely that they're going to be interviewing for multiple positions. The contradicting piece of advice here is don't act too quickly. Give yourself at least the evening to consider whether or not you would like to offer someone the job. In my experience, your impression of someone you've interviewed will change slightly once you've had the opportunity to reflect. Sometimes you'll perceive their interview more favourably after a short time has passed, and sometimes you won't, but I definitely think just waiting a little bit is worthwhile. The amount of time you decide to wait before contacting your candidates is ultimately your decision. My recommendation would be to contact them within 24 hours, but as I said, that's up to you. In the fantastic scenario that you've interviewed multiple candidates for the position, who do you call first? I would suggest calling your first choice candidate first. And that might sound obvious, but maybe to some people it isn't. The reason I say it is because it isn't unusual, in my experience, for people to turn down a job offer. There are many reasons why people might do that. Try not to take it personally. You won't be the first person it happens to, and you definitely won't be the last. If it does happen, and you've not yet spoken to, say, your second choice, and you quite like your second choice, then you can just call them and offer them the job. Obviously, if you've interviewed someone and you're certain they're not right for you, and no matter who refuses the job, that you're definitely not going to give it to them, then call them at your earliest convenience and just let them know. If you live in Wigan, we can always support you with that and calling the unsuccessful candidates if that's what you want to do. So you've chosen your candidate. I want to cover a few considerations you should make before giving them a call, because it's likely when you offer the candidate the job, it will be on a number of conditions. So whether they have a positive reference, whether they have a DBS check and that comes back, how you would expect it to. Are you going to offer them a probationary period? Because you probably want to mention that when you're offering them the job. Are you going to be doing any kind of trial shifts? And we'll talk a little bit more about them. So I'm going to run through these different considerations you might want to make before giving someone a ring and offering them the job. And this will just, help you avoid any potential issues, so you can be really clear of what the job offer is subject to. So if we start with checking references. So for those of you who don't know, checking references, this means speaking to people who the candidate knows in a professional or personal capacity who can tell you a little bit more about what they're like. And that, to some people who aren't used to recruiting people, might sound quite formal, but it's a useful exercise, as obviously during an interview you only have a short time to get to know someone. How you check references is quite straightforward. You just ask the candidate for one or two people you can contact who can tell you things that are important. That might be about their reliability, punctuality, work ethic, etc. If you have recruited through Embrace, the person will have provided some potential references on their initial application form, so we can support with that. You can then contact them, the referees, however you feel best. So you could text them, you could email, you could send a letter, you could give them a ring. I mean, I often find just giving a quick phone call works well. Maybe a written reference is more traditional. And again, if you live in Wigan, we can assist you to gather them references. We've got a template that we can kind of email to referees and then collect them for you. Often a reference check, doesn't tell you anything you don't already know, because obviously the candidate's the one who's provided you with the reference, so they will be more or less aware of what to expect. I would be cautious if you discover something that the candidate's not already disclosed. And you can always give us a call and discuss that if you are feeling a bit unsure whether or not to proceed with the employment after hearing something from a referee. It's not compulsory to ask for references, so if you decide that you know the person well enough and you don't feel like you need them, then that's fine. But I think it's particularly useful if you don't know the person, or you've not known them before and you don't have any kind of mutual connections. Because at the end of the day, if you do have a mutual connection and they say they're all right, that in essence is an informal reference. And that's it on references, so nothing too much to worry about. And again, if there's not enough information there, you can always give us a call and we can talk through it in a bit more detail. Next is DBS checks. So a DBS is an abbreviation for the term Disclosure and Bearing Service, and it's a way to check someone's criminal record, basically. So if you live in Wigan and you're employing a personal assistant to work with someone under the age of 18, they can't start work until they've got a DBS. And that's worth knowing because it take about 4 to 8 weeks to come through. So obviously, there's no point giving that person a start date until they've got the DBS back. So you might give them an estimated start date or a potential start date, but that will have to vary depending on whether or not the DBS has come through. If you're over 18, you can choose to employ someone without having this check. Although, personally, I would advise against it. It's always good to go through that process. So the final piece of information I want to cover on DBS checks is what happens if someone has a criminal conviction. So the DBS service have what is called a barred list. And if a person shows up on that list, it means they've committed a serious crime related to children and young people or vulnerable adults, and means they're not suitable for this type of work. So they won't be offered a job. There are, however, other criminal convictions that don't necessarily prevent someone working within health and social care, and your discretion can be applied. Firstly, I would say, if the first time you're hearing about this conviction is when the DBS check returns, that's not necessarily the best sign. You would hope that it would come out either within the person's application or they would talk to you about it at interview and be open and honest. Secondly, I would say making a decision on whether to employ someone who has a criminal conviction is complex, and you want to really look at the sort of positives, negatives, the risks attached to engaging in that employment. So I would always advise speaking to us here at Embrace, having a conversation with us, or speaking to the direct payments team. Even if you haven't come through us for recruitment, you can still come and have that conversation with us and we can give you support. And I would always recommend that you do that. Because there are obviously people working with the health and social care sector who have had previous criminal convictions but have been sort of rehabilitated and are essential for the health and social care workforce and do a great job. So it doesn't always mean if someone has had that history that they can't go on to be, a good social care professional, a personal assistant, but do kind of talk to us and get that advice. I think that covers everything on DBS checks. I will also leave a link to a website that has some good information on employing candidates who have had criminal convictions. If you live in Wigan, the direct payments team can assist you to get your PA's a DBS check. You just give them a call, provide them with your new PA's details, and on the screen now is the direct payments team's number. However, you'll most likely have a contact for your own direct payments officer already. Next bit is probation periods. So I'll talk a little bit more about contracts of employment later in this webinar. However, one point generally included in a PA's contract, it's standard in most contracts really, is details on a probation period. And the probation period is just a period of time for both you and your new PA to see if the role's a good fit. It's not the same as a trial shift. Person is your employee. They'll assign a contract of employment. They are your employee. It's just a period of time before they're made permanent. And how long that probation period is generally down to your discretion. So when you get the contract of employment, like I said, I'll talk through it in a bit, you can alter that yourself for how long you want it to be. What sort of guidance says is it must be deemed reasonable. So you'd be unlikely that you're having a probation period that's lasting a year. Reasonable for a PA, I would say, is probably somewhere between 6 weeks and 6 months, depending on the role and the complexity of it. There's a good guide on probation periods on safeworkers.co.uk, and I've put a link to that guidance in the description. So if you are interested in finding a little bit more about probation periods, you can give that a read. Don't let it concern you, and don't let it concern your new PA too much. If you do mention it on the call that there's a probationary period, you can just explain to them that it's standard in most contracts and it doesn't impact the statutory rights. So they still need to be paid at least minimum wage, they still receive holiday pay, they still get statutory sick pay, everything like that. So, it's nothing too much to worry about. And if you, like I said, if you do want further guidance on it, you can always speak to your insurance provider, and I'll discuss your insurance provider in a little bit more detail later. And again, you can always give us a ring here at Embrace or speak to direct payments team. So the last thing I would want to mention is, so the last topic I'd like to cover relates to a trial shift. Now, a trial shift shouldn't be confused with a probationary period. A probationary period is when someone has been offered the job and have started employment with you. A trial shift is an extension of an interview, practically. I would be really mindful if you are going to use a trial shift, particularly if it's going to be unpaid. There is guidance from HMRC which says that a trial shift has got to be genuinely for recruitment purposes. It shouldn't exceed a reasonable time to assess a candidate's abilities. Now, obviously, reasonable is subjective. I would say anything over a couple of hours, if it's not going to be paid, is going into the realms of unreasonable. And the candidate should be being closely observed. So if, for instance, the candidate's going to be working but no one's going to be looking or checking their ability, then questions will be asked on whether or not it is a trial or you're just trying to get someone to do unpaid work. So there are considerations to be made. What I would say is, if you are going to offer someone a trial shift, maybe check with your insurance providers around the legalities on how it should look. But definitely, agree a set time for the trial period with the candidate. Discuss payment with them. If you're not going to pay, explain, when they'll start, when they'll finish, what the purpose is, and be really clear that it isn't going to be paid. What I would say in terms of paying someone for a trial shift is don't let sort of signing someone up to payroll deter you. It's quite easy to sort of set someone up on payroll and just ensure they're paid for the trial shift, which can sort of resolve a lot of issues if it is something that you are going to do. If you're not sure on how to kind of quickly just set up someone on payroll, give us a call and we can support you to do this. But I'm not going to go into any more detail on trial shifts. What I would say is there is some really great information on the HMRC's website, but also on a website called Safe Workers that gives quite an easy read guide on trial shifts. So I'll share the link to that in the description of this video. So something for you to have a read and have a look at if it is something that you use part of your recruitment process. So I hope that doesn't sound like there's lots of considerations you need to make before even ringing a person to offer them the job, and it's not, I've not provided that information in any way, shape, or form to try and scare you. It's really straightforward stuff. It's just things that kind of apply when you are employing someone. And once you've got your head around it and you've done it once, it's really straightforward. And we're always here to talk to and offer support if you need it. So we're at the stage now, you've made all those necessary considerations on what you need to do, what conditions you're offering the job on. And you're now calling your first choice candidate. So we know, they're going to need a DBS. There's going to be a probationary period of, say, 6 weeks. We know that we are going to be checking references, so the job's going to be subject to references. So we know those things, we've got them in our head, and we're calling the first choice candidate. When you call them, if the candidate says they'd like more time to decide whether or not they want the job, that's a possibility. I personally think that's okay. Again, like I said before, it might be that they've interviewed for another position and they're not 100% sure which one they want to take. And while that might feel frustrating to you, the reality is that that's the sector at the minute. There's lots of jobs available, so people are interviewing for multiple. However, I would only give them a set amount of time to decide, maybe a day or two. And if you don't hear back, you can assume the decline, you can move on to your next candidate. Because obviously, if you have got a second candidate in mind and you think actually they're okay, you don't want to leave it too long before you give them a ring. So I think sort of 24 hours is, well enough time. Obviously, it comes down to you again. If you want to give a person more time now because they give you certain information that makes you feel that more time is necessary, or is someone who you really want, then that's up to you. But I would say, again, nothing more than 24 hours, and you'd be wanting to hear back. Assuming that the candidate's now accepted the job, you probably want to just clarify hourly rate again and working hours. If your recruiter's using our service, the candidate should be, more than clear what the hourly rate is and what hours are working. And you've probably mentioned it in the interview. However, just reiterating again when you offer the job won't do any harm. Just, what are the hours? When you expecting the person to start? When are you expecting them to finish? What they're going to be paid? Always, useful in that call. Then I would discuss start dates. So this is important because if the candidate's got another job at the minute, so they're in another job and they move into you, it's most likely going to need to work a notice period. But that shouldn't prevent you from setting a start date and a start time and start location. So most likely for individual employers, that's going to be your home. So I would say, right, we're going to start in 4 weeks' time, Monday the X of whatever. You're going to be there for 9 o'clock. You might even tell them, that first day, there might be another PA there who can talk you through the role, or I'll give you an induction or whatever that might be. You can have a bit of a chat to them about it. And then if you've got a computer, or you've got email, or even a text message, what I would do is after the call is I would send a text message that just says, so like, nice talking to you on the phone, really glad that you're going to be joining my team, or that you're going to be my new PA. As agreed on the phone, the start date will be XYZ, start time will be, I would just follow it up with that. Maybe even the hours and the pay rate on the text, just so you've got that bit of a sort of written information between you both. You'd also want to set a date on the form for completing paperwork. So there's paperwork that includes a contract of employment, which again, I said we'll talk about in a little while, gathering details for payroll. And it might be a lot of employers, individual employers, will do that on the personal assistant's first day. But some people organise a meeting in advance, and that's completely up to you. I would suggest, say for instance, the person's only going to be starting work in 4 weeks' time, it might be nice to set a date, say within 2 weeks' time to complete the paperwork, and that just allows you to be in frequent contact before they start work. So what you wouldn't want is a scenario where you give them a call, you've offered them the job, the start date is in 4 to 6 weeks' time, and you don't speak at all, between those 2 dates, because that's going to create probably anxiety for you, thinking, are they actually going to turn up? It's probably going to cause anxiety for the candidate as well. So that's a good reason for you to sort of meet up, to kind of fill the contract in, do the payroll details in between. That's about it on that call. Now, there is quite a bit of stuff there. Now, we have a call checklist that if you want that and you think that's easy, so you can check it off as you're going through, that's fine. Or after listening to this, you might decide that you can create your own checklist, which go ahead. Or you might think you don't need one and you can remember that information and just make the call. But yeah, there are things I'd take into consideration when you're offering someone the job. So, person's accepted the job, you've had that call, you give them a start date, what next? I would make contact with the direct payments team, particularly if this is the first personal assistant you've employed. Again, I've put on the screen the number of the direct payments team and an email address for them. But as I pointed out before, you'll hopefully have a name worker by now and you have contact details for them. Give them a call, tell them you've recruited. If your new personal assistant needs a DBS, as I said before, they'll be able to support you with this. So just tell them that they need a DBS, provide your PA details, and they'll get in contact and start that process rolling. Other pieces of paperwork you'll need from your direct payments advisor is information on your insurance, because you will have insurance, information and paperwork on your payroll provider, some weekly timesheets, and a template contract of employment. Now, you can ask for copies of these documents electronically, in which case they'll just email you those documents across if they haven't done already. However, if you don't use a computer or you don't have a printer and you'd like a hard copy, they'll also send the documents out via the post. So if you just ask your direct payments advisor to do that, they will. Now, what I'll do now is talk through these documents and bits of the process in a little bit more detail. So if we start with insurance, if you employ a personal assistant and you're receiving funding via health and social care in Wigan, you will have an insurance provider. That's costed in, it's part of the sort of having a direct payment and employing personal assistants. And there are different insurance options available. However, the most commonly used by individual employers in Wigan, in my experience, is Premier Care. And your direct payments advisor will most likely provide you information on your insurance provider and what's covered. If they haven't, ask them and they will get you some. Now, most people who I speak to haven't had any contact with their insurance company, and that's great because there's been no instance where they've needed insurance, which is great. It's just there in the background and it just makes sure if needed it's a safety net, like insurance for anything like your car insurance. Unless you're in an accident, you don't speak to your insurance provider. But what I would say is that in this case, your insurance provider can be really useful for other things. So I would make yourself familiar with them. I would kind of make sure you have the number, because they do offer things like employment support, and it's a 24. If you have Premier Care, it's a 24/7 helpline, and they can just help you if you've got any issues with a personal assistant and you're not sure what to do in terms of like processes, procedures, disciplinary action if that's needed. So they're great for that, and you can give them a ring and you'll get sort of legal advice there. They can offer quite a bit of support. So definitely sort of make sure you know the number and you're familiar. And I'm also told by some individual employers that Premier Care, again, they can offer you personal assistance discount card for like shops and things like that. So maybe that gives you a good reason to just find the number and give them a ring. So you're used to giving them a call and asking about that sort of discount card for personal assistance. As I said, the insurance is costing into the package, so it is an additional payment you're going to need to make. However, as I understand, you can pay for upgrades if you wanted to. That might be worth you having a look into that yourself. But just definitely what I would say is just be aware of what you're covered for, what your insurance company's number is, and have those details to hand should you ever need it. Okay, so next let's discuss payroll, how you pay your personal assistants. Again, there's different payroll providers and there's different ways that you can manage your direct payment, but most commonly people choose to have a managed account, and they use in Wigan, the most popular or one of the popular payroll providers is Disability Direct, or you might know it as DD Payroll. And what they will do, and what a managed account means, is that they'll just look after everything for you, really. They'll look after the money. All you'll have to do is just ring up or text once every 4 weeks generally, and just tell them the amount of hours your personal assistant has worked, and they will do the rest. They will also be able to do things like if you call them and ask, what's your personal assistant's holiday entitlement, they'll be able to tell you how many hours holiday they're entitled to and different things like that. So they're really useful. What you would need to do is just tell the direct payments team when your personal assistant is going to start, so they can ensure that the money is filtering into that account, and then gather some paperwork from the direct payments team that your personal assistant would fill in. And I'll put that paperwork on the screen now so you can see it. And it's just really basic information that the personal assistant will have, and just bring them along. Like I said, whether you do this on the first day or whether you decide to do this in between them starting, either way is fine. And just get them to fill that information in. That's like the bank details, their national insurance number, and you would just then send that off to DD Payroll, and you can do that just via the post. If you're not keen on sort of posting things, you could always send it to us. We could scan it in and email it across to DD Payroll if that's something you prefer. But it's quite a quick, simple process, and that just sets them up on your account, and it just means when you ring through, it just quite easily they pay the money. They'll work out things like employers' national insurance contributions, pension payments if that's needed. I'll talk in a little bit more detail about pension payments later. They'll do pretty much everything for you, so it's quite simple and straightforward. The last thing that we mentioned was timesheets, and that just links with this really. What you will need when your personal assistant starts working is to record when they work and how many hours they're working, and that'll be really useful just to have to hand when you're audited by the local authority. And we're not going to talk about audits on this call, but it is something that your direct payments team, your direct payments officer will discuss with you, or you can speak to us and we'll discuss it in a bit more detail. But yeah, it just kind of gives you that trail of how many hours they've worked and when they've worked them. But it makes it really easy for you as well, just then to look at your timesheets, and when you ring the DD payroll to ring the hours, so you can say, oh, they've worked this many hours. Obviously, payroll won't need to know the sort of breakdown of when they've worked unless there's differentiating pay. So if, for instance, evening pay is at a high rate or overnight stays are paid differently, it's not an hourly rate and you have like a sort of block payment, they would need to know that. But relatively speaking, they're not going to want to look at the timesheets. You're just ringing through the hours. You can also email through the hours if you want to. And I believe that some people now can actually WhatsApp through the hours as well, which makes things really easy. So nothing really to worry about. The only thing at this stage, and we're talking about before your personal assistant started, is just that you have that paperwork that you can fill out with your new PA, because obviously they're going to want to make sure they can get paid and that you've got the timesheet so they can write down when they've worked. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is a contract of employment. Now, what I would say is that in my years of working in Wigan, I have come across individual employers who haven't given the personal assistant a contract of employment, and it isn't really an option whether or not to give someone a contract. You should be giving them a contract before they start work. So just because it might seem a little bit complicated or you feel like it's very formal giving someone a contract, don't shy away from it. There's a template provided for you that I'm going to show you now. And just going through that with the personal assistant at the beginning of their employment is really useful. Both sign it, and it's just that agreement between yourselves that sort of sets the tone of what's going to come and what both of your legal duties are. Now, what I would say is that I'm not a specialist in employment law, so I'm not going to talk about this contract in terms of which bits should be changed or where would you want to add things or anything like that. I'm just going to show you the template that Wigan Council will send you and the parts of the contract that in red, which gives you the options to amend. If you do want to talk in detail about the contract and you want to make specific changes to it, I would advise speaking to your insurance provider and the employer support there, because they'll be able to help. But all I would say is make sure you have a contract of employment in place, and I'll show you the one that you will be sent by Wigan Council. So this is the contract of employment that Wigan will send you, and it's, in my experience, a basic contract. There's nothing in there that you wouldn't expect to see in a contract, really. Pretty standard employment contract. At the top, it's asking for the employer's name and the employer's address. So the employer will be, if you're an adult particularly, the person receiving the care. So the person whose direct payment it is. If you are under 18, it'll more than likely be your parents or carer's name, or whoever's sort of looking after the budget, and their address. And then the employee, of course, is the personal assistant, the personal assistant's address. Then you have the option of putting in the date when the personal assistant starts. So again, we spoke about that when we was having that initial phone call. You'll have a start date and you'll pop that in there. And that's just important because it kind of tells you how many years the personal assistant is working, and that's like a record to say that's when they started. So the first bit of the contract that's in red is the probationary period part of the contract, and we spoke about this in quite a bit of detail earlier in the webinar. And you can see that it says you will join me on an initial probationary period of 6 months, and 6 is in red. And that just gives you the option, if you want to change it, and you can make that a smaller number or a higher number. My recommendation would be I wouldn't go any more than 6 unless you've got a specific reason to do so, but you could choose to reduce it if you wanted to. Your place of work, there's a red line there, and that's just saying where will the person normally work. And as a personal assistant, it's more than likely it's going to be your home. It's going to be where they've got to turn up to work each day. It might not be. If you're someone who's receiving support from a personal assistant at a specific venue, then it might be that venue where they turn up to. So you would put that in there. An example, it might be a young person who goes to trampolining, and they might have a personal assistant with them at trampolining, so that might be where you meet, and they might never come to your home, so you could put that in there. Then at the bottom, you can see there's red bits that say you will not be required to work outside the United Kingdom for a periods exceeding 1 month. So you can just delete that as it applies. If your personal assistant is really going to, isn't going to be expected to work outside the United Kingdom, you could just change that to will not for periods exceeding 1 month. And that covers you, because, for instance, if you might go on holiday, then you just say they'll not be expected to work outside for longer than 1 month, but you may kind of have someone who works outside there for like a week if you go on holiday to wherever. So the next part of the contract you have the opportunity to amend. It's just your normal hours of work. So you would just write the normal hours of work, how many hours that personal assistant would normally work each week in there. And then at the bottom, you can see, or just below that, you can see it says or 0 hours. So if you have someone on 0 hours contract, that would most likely be if the bank staff, they're only going to be working a few times a year and it's ad hoc, then you would delete the top bit and have the bottom bit in instead. But if they are your general staff who's doing regular hours each week, you would just delete the 0 hours bit. Then it says remuneration, which essentially is wage. So it says your wage is currently, and you can change like wage to black and just write where the pound sign is, how many hours per hour that the person is getting paid. And then for weekly is in red as well, because it might be that you decide to pay your personal assistant more regular than 4 weeks. You might pay bi-weekly. But again, standard in Wigan would be that you pay people 4 weekly. So often you'll just be changing that to black, and that will be standard, and that's fine. Then we're not able, or you are able, but you're not recommended to make any changes then until you get to holiday arrangements. And holiday arrangements is exactly the same, where it just has a section for a contracted member of staff, and then you'll see in red it says if 0 hours, delete fixed hours. And again, that would mainly be if you've got someone who's doing bank, who's doing the odd hours, and the holiday entitlement then would change slightly, or different wording would be more suitable. So you just delete the top bit and keep the bottom bit. And the holiday arrangements part is the last bit of the contract that Wigan Council have highlighted for you to alter. Other than that, it is ready to go and it can just be left as is. It would just be the final page where it gives you an option to sign it. You see it on the screen there. You'd sign as the employee and sign as the employer, or on behalf of the employer if needed to, if the employer wasn't able to sign it because of the impairment. The thing I want to mention that's just above is the auto-enrolment pension scheme. And as I said earlier in the webinar, there is a great resource by Skills for Care called Before Your PA Starts, and they've got some really good information on pensions that you can have a read through, and just so you can get your head around it. What I would say is that your payroll provider will offer you a lot of support with that. So if you have any questions, you can speak to them. And generally, it is just people between 22 and state pension age, earning over £833 a month, who would be auto-enrolled. And if they are auto-enrolled, you would make a contribution. But again, that is factored in when your budget's been calculated. So it isn't something for you to worry about. It isn't kind of more money you're going to have to put in to support that. But if you have got any kind of worries or concerns, like I said, have a read of that document by Skills for Care, speak to your payroll provider, speak to the direct payments team. There's lots of support available for you. Okay. So that covers us for today, and that's pretty much everything you need to know in terms of employing your first personal assistant. What I would say to you is, there is support there for you, so you're never doing this alone. So if any step of the journey or anything I've spoken about today, you're still feeling a little bit confused or overwhelmed, just speak to someone. But what I wouldn't do is just avoid doing certain things because they seem complicated. So I have spoken to people over the last sort of 10 years who have not given the PAs an employment contract, and it's really important that you do that, or you're not using timesheets, and then that becomes really difficult when it comes to audit. They're the type of things that you really want to make sure are in place. Hopefully the advice I've given you today is useful. I'm going to be making a few more webinars on different parts of the sort of employee journey, and we're going to talk a little bit about retaining staff and managing conflicts. So that might be something that interests you, as you move on in your journey as an employer. But yeah, thank you very much for listening today. Hopefully, you come along to one of our individual employer workshops that we have at Embrace, and you can find information about them on our website. We obviously have a Facebook page where we advertise lots of stuff and lots of opportunities for individual employers to get along with. Skills for Care website is a great resource just for anything to do with individual employers, personal assistance. So always, have a look on there. There's lots of kind of training that you can apply for. There's like a funding part, the Individual Employers Training Fund, and you can get training for your PAs through that, quite specific training, which is great. So have a look at that as well. Thank you very much for your time. I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye.